In this lesson, we'll learn how to export our Ptex textures out of Mari. Okay, so I have the Mari archive 06_begin open here. So essentially it's the same archive we looked at in the previous lesson, only I've added a few more bits of information here, namely in terms of specular gain and specular roughness for the four objects that we have here inside this project. And let's say that we've been texturing on our first Ptex project here in Mari, and now we're ready to take these textures and get them out so we can start rendering these out. So let's go ahead and take a look at this process here. So if we take a look here first at the horns_diffuse object, we can see here that we've got our shader here, our gargoyle shader. We've got a few shader modules, and we've got a few channels over here. So essentially the process of exporting these out is going to begin with baking our shader down, just like it would if we were using UVs with this project. So let's go ahead and jump over here to the shaders and right click on our gargoyle shader. We'll go ahead and just select the Bake Shader option here. And this dialog hopefully looks familiar to you. And we're going to make sure that our Gargoyle shader is selected over here on the left. And now we're going to go ahead and begin selecting the components that we want to bake down into separate channels. So you can see here that we can select information like diffuse or unlit information here, specular information. So we definitely want to go with the specular gain and specular roughness. And we could even bake down the ambient occlusion onto a channel if for whatever reason we needed that. So I'm just going to go ahead and select diffuse, specular gain, and specular roughness. We can choose to name that channel here. You can see I'll just leave these as the default, but we could actually type in whatever there. So the next option is the bleed option. You'll see that by default the speculars are both set to bleed, and the diffuse is not. Now if you're working with a triangulated mesh, I would highly recommend bleeding your edges here, because if you don't, you'll probably end up with some kind of artifacts around the edges of your faces. So if you're using a mesh that's all quads, then I would just recommend experimenting. Try it without bleeding, try it with bleeding. Depending on what you're working on, you may or may not experience some kind of artifacts. So we'll just go ahead and set those to bleed, and let's go ahead and set the type. We'll just leave those actually at their defaults here. We need color for the diffuse and scalar for both the speculars, and we can go ahead and change these over to just normal RGB channels. I don't need that alpha component. So we've got all that set. I'll go ahead and click the bake button here, and Mari's going to begin the process of baking down that information into separate channels for me here. You can see here that it's actually completed. That went pretty quickly. So we'll just jump over here, and you can see the three channels here for the horns object. We've got our diffuse, our specular gain, and our specular roughness. So now at this point we're ready to begin exporting these out. So let's go ahead and start with the diffuse information. I'm just simply going to come over here, and just like in a UV-based project, we're going to right-click on the channel and choose to export it here. And once Mari picks that up, there we go. We're going to get this Export Horns Diffuse Channel dialog box here. And let's just choose a location to save this. I'm just going to save this in the project files folder I've got going here. I'll just save it in the root of that. So I'm going to actually delete these. I'm not going to include these texture files for you, because you can always export these out with this archive yourself. So let's go ahead and kind of talk about this dialog, because it looks a little different than what we're probably used to. We'll first go ahead and take a look down here at the Ptex file template. You can see here that by default we have $geo.ptex. So this $geo variable, or geometry variable, is one of the three variables that we can use at this point to have Mari automatically name the files it's generating. So this $geo is going to generate multiple Ptex files using the geometry name to name the files. Now, keep in mind that we're using an object here that has, or rather a project that has 4 different objects in it. Each one of those objects only has a single piece of geometry. Well, I guess except for the horns, it's got 2 pieces. So if we had maybe one object that had all these pieces of geometry in it, and we had told Mari when we created the project to create separate pieces of geometry, then this $geo variable would be a good one to use if we wanted to be able to piece back together our project one piece of geometry at a time. So we could tell Mari to output separate Ptex files for each of those pieces of geometry using this $geo variable. Now, that's not the case here. I don't need that, so I'm actually going to use a little different one here first. So let me just change this. I'm going to change this to $entity. Now, this particular variable is going to tell Mari to output a single Ptex file using the object name to name the file with. So in this case, the horns _diffuse object over here, you can see that using that entity variable, we're getting a file name of horns _diffuse.ptex. Now, because we're outputting multiple different types of information here, being the diffuse information as well as specular gain and specular roughness, then I want to go ahead and add one other variable here. And we'll just do an underscore to separate those. And this next variable is $channel. So that variable is going to add the channel name to the file names that we're outputting. So you can see here that this first Ptex file that we're outputting for diffuse information on this horns object is going to be named horns _diffuse _diffuse. The word diffuse is only repeated there because it's both in the object name over here as well as the channel name. So let's go ahead and move on. We'll just jump down here to the Ptex option, and you'll see here that we have basically Mari's asking, what do we want to do with face mipmaps? And you can see if we jump over here, we can either include them or we can exclude them. Now, if you're familiar with the process of mip mapping, you'll know that basically that's the process of including multiple resolutions of the same texture, so that if maybe the object that we have textured is going to appear further away, we don't have to use the highest resolution textures when we're rendering it. We can actually use one of the lower resolution versions included with the mip maps here. So we'll just say include for that and bounce down here to the Ptex metadata. And here you can see again we have options to include or exclude each of these three particular items here. So we've got the geometry. Again, this is a really important one if you're wanting to create new projects in Mari based on the Ptex file rather than an OBJ file. So if this is not set to include the geometry, then we won't be able to do that. We'll just be able to import the textures onto existing OBJ geometry. So other options here, you can see we have the user attributes that we can actually include as well as the adjacency information. Let's go ahead and just say all to this, and I'll go ahead and click that button there. And we'll wait here as Mari exports out our Ptex file. And let me just bounce over here to our project files. There we go. And you can see that we've outputted our first Ptex file based on the textures in this project. So again, the process overall isn't a lot different than what you would experience if you were using UVs with your Mari project. Basically, you're going to be baking down the information that you want to export out. In this case, for this object, we've got the diffuse information, specular gain, and specular roughness. And then we would simply just right-click on the baked down channels, choose Export, and let me just go ahead and apply my variables again here. I believe we were using entity and channel. There we go. And we'll go ahead and just browse over to that exact same location here and again export out our second Ptex file. So you're going to bake and then export each channel that you want to output out of Mari here. Alright, so we've exported out 2 of the channels for this particular object. If you want to practice that, feel free to use this project to practice exporting out some Ptex textures. I won't be including the textures from this particular project in the project files. We've got a large number of Ptex files in that referenced files folder for you to play with that we're going to be looking at beginning in the next lesson. So at this point, let's go ahead and move on and learn how we can actually create projects from Ptex files, as well as how we can import Ptex textures onto channels in an existing project.